So welcome to Class on the Left. Starting a little bit belatedly, this is a panel presented by the Boston College chapter of the Platypus Affiliate Society. Platypus was established in 2006. It organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism, focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the 1920s to 30s, old left, the 1960s to 70s, new left, the 1980s to 90s, post-political left, exploring the possibilities for emancipatory politics today. So our student club at BC holds coffee breaks, public events, and a weekly reading group at 7 p.m. on Mondays. Alternatively, there's another reading group, an at-large group, on Zoom, Sundays at 2 p.m. Please add your contact info to the sign-up sheet that's being passed around. I'm sure it's already been passed around. And take a copy of the monthly publication, Platypus Review, which I have a bunch of in my backpack if anyone needs them. Now to introduce our panelists, I suppose they'll speak from this side over towards Will. So first we have Tom Canel. He is a union staff person with SHARE, AFSCME. For many years, he was a member of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and then its successor organization, the Democratic Socialists of America. Tom recently let his DSA membership lapse because it has become too left-wing for him. Next, Sam Biasi is a PhD candidate in international relations here at BC. Their dissertation is a study of terrorism and strategic culture. Next in line is Henry DeGroot. He's a union organizer with Massachusetts Drivers United and co-managing editor of working-mass.com, which is the DSA Massachusetts labor blog. Finally is Will Stratford. He's a member of Platypus and a third-year PhD student in history here at BC. I ran up the stairs halfway, got lost. So the panel will start with 10 minutes of opening remarks from each panelist, and I'll give you a signal. Well, I don't know how I'll do that, but I'll try to give you a signal of some sort when there's 1 minute left. And then you'll each have 3 minutes to respond to each other's opening remarks. After that, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And finally, one last thing, I'd like to read the prompt for this discussion, if I can catch my breath. So it starts with a quotation from Marx. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And the later one from Adorno. According to theory, history is the history of class struggles, but the concept of class is bound up with the emergence of the proletariat. So we ask, what is the relationship between class and the left? How does the bourgeois revolution relate to class contradiction in capitalism? Is the left a bourgeois category? And if so, what does this mean? What is the political significance of the class struggle in the 19th and 20th centuries? And what was the meaning of the left wing for that struggle? What is class for the left today? And how does it relate to the task of overcoming capitalism? So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tom for your opening remarks, please.
Thanks, Luke. And thanks so much to BC Platypus for inviting me. My remarks are going to basically derive from how I have been able to think about the left and class over the years. First as a teenage Labour Party member in Britain, and then, as Luke said, a member of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and then DSA, starting in '79. And after college, I went on to basically become a union activist, and then got elected to the leadership of my union, my local, and then became a staff person. During my teenage years in the Labour Party Young Socialists in Britain, Marxists taught me that the bourgeois revolution ushered in capitalism as a new dominant mode of production, with the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, as its new ruling class. According to this understanding of history, just as the bourgeoisie had constituted a rising class that challenged feudalism and went on to establish capitalism, the industrial proletariat would be a rising class that would challenge capitalism and establish socialism. Since capitalism presumably expanded and was based on ruthless exploitation, the exploited proletariat would become the majority of society, and as the new rising class would come to challenge capitalism itself and usher in socialism and then communism by way of dictatorship of the proletariat. Although the industrial proletariat, it was recognized, is not necessarily the only class dominated under capitalism, it alone, I was taught, is genuinely revolutionary and is capable of establishing socialism. How so? Well, for my instructors in Marxism, and I think practically all Leninists and Trotskyists of that generation, at least, the proletariat being an industrial proletariat was key. Proletarian factory life was assumed to impose the instinctive collectivism and discipline necessary for the acquisition of socialist ideology and revolutionary agency alike. Through the self-discipline enabled by industrial production, the proletariat's most advanced members are able to form themselves into a highly disciplined vanguard, the Revolutionary Party, that is able to lead the class as a whole in confronting and outmaneuvering the centralized capitalist state and overthrow it. For better or worse, much of the history of the left is a narrative of internal factional dispute. Consistently, the lack of industrial-based proletarians within a faction has been a source of vulnerability for that faction. The lack of an industrial proletarian background raises the suspicion, or has raised the suspicion, that one lacks the proletarian discipline necessary to be a good revolutionary. This suspicion was exemplified in Leon Trotsky's and James Cannon's attack upon the supporters of Max Shachtman in the seminal struggle with the American Socialist Workers' Party from 1939 to 1940. The spark of the faction fight that ended in organizational split was whether the Nazi-Soviet pact required reconsideration of the party's critical but unconditional defense of the Stalinist regime in Russia from capitalist attack. Trotsky and Canel weaponized the non-proletarian backgrounds of many of Shachtman's supporters. Canel claimed that it was the lack of a proletarian background that led to dilettantish indiscipline and lay behind many Shachtmanites questioning the SWP's long-held characterization of the Soviet regime as a degenerate worker state that merited critical but unconditional defense. To combat their innate dilettantish tendencies, Trotsky argued that non-proletarian members should be required to recruit an actual industrial proletarian to the party within a particular period of time to prove their revolutionary mettle. If they were unable to do so, they should eventually be, according to Trotsky, expelled from the party. Trotsky did not feel that members who were themselves from an industrial proletarian background should be tested in this way. Now, the cynic might wonder whether petty bourgeois supporters of Canel would be held to the same standards as their Shachtmanite counterparts, but that's a discussion for another day. Starting roughly in the 1980s, a mutation of capitalism created a working class decreasingly industrial in composition. Fewer workers, although all still suffer from capitalist domination, are subjected to the discipline of the factory. Socialization within the factory can no longer be held to be indispensable to the working class's revolutionary potential, if the working class is still to be considered potentially revolutionary. While this conceptual shift can be justified in Marxist language, it nevertheless goes against the grain of much of the tradition. Resonance with Cannon's and Trotsky's focus on the revolutionary impacts of factory discipline follows neatly from the Communist Manifesto and Lenin's one step forward, 2 steps back, for example. In the last few decades, leftists have tended to base their understanding of class less on the relations of industrial production. Instead, they began to see class identity as conjuncturally constructed within specific historical constellations. Class identity is identified through a family resemblance in salient demographic and sociological indices, such as income level, whether they are a wage earner, whether their work is considered primarily manual or mental, education level, ethnicity, race, culture, and most importantly for my own development, whether they are integral into the labor movement or not. If one is not tied to Marxism, one can invoke Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblance. To maintain one's Marxist street cred, it was probably advisable to speak of overdetermination of class in the way as per the work of Louis Althusser. The political potential of the working class at any time will, according to this understanding, be shaped by the specific historical constellations of that moment. The politics of the pandemic demonstrates the necessity, I would argue, for the left to reconsider its understanding of class politics. Traditionally, with the possible exception of anarchism, leftism has involved the promotion of public health institutions and hopefully democratic social regulation in general. New leftists justified their apologetics for Castroism and or Maoism by progress regarding public health in Cuba and China. Western European adoption of free universal healthcare is the jewel in the crown of European social democracy. Working class politics were assumed to involve promotion of public health and democratic social regulation that enabled human flourishing. However, significant numbers of working class people, if not a majority, have developed a mistrust of, if not an antipathy for, public health experts and the social regulation of individual behavior, even if it were more democratically enacted than it has been. I would claim that this relates to the increasing salience of education level for class identity, leading to a suspicion of health and policy experts, as well as an increasing individualism, possibly associated with the relative diminution of industrial production in the economy, as I previously discussed. Though the pandemic theoretically showcased capitalism's failings, right populism, rather than left politics, have made discernible inroads into working class consciousness. This is deeply problematic for the left, and I would argue constitutes a profound crisis for it, as well as those of us in the official labor movement, by the way. This crisis imposes upon the left the task of reconceptualizing how it practices the class politics. With respect to the labor movement, we need to understand, for example, and here I think I might respectfully disagree with some other speakers on the panel, that we need to understand, for example, that an orientation to the militant minority within the workplace, for people who advocate that there actually isn't a necessary correlation between shop for militancy, as invaluable as it may be, and the working class moving in a progressive, let alone leftist direction. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Sam, would you like to-
Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Platypus for having me. So I'd just like to start by, when I was asked again this panel, my first question to myself was, what is the left? How do we define it? Can it be defined? And what I came to was, it is a fuzzy, socially defined concept that is ever changing and evolving. I don't think that there is a way that you can temporally and geographically tie the left together in a way that would both satisfy most people who call themselves leftists and not accidentally include people who would not consider themselves leftists. That being said, of course, the left is something in any given context that we can all understand to have at any given time. You know, I can tell you, I can say the left and you know what I mean. That is to say, right? Now, this is in opposition to class, our other topic, because class can in some sense be objectively derived, at least in terms of the relationship to production. Of course, So my fellow panelists said, production has changed vastly over time in the 20th century, especially, and now, especially in COVID, we're in a situation where class solidarity is ever harder to find naturally occurring as it did in the industrial workplace. Especially during COVID, the increasing individualization, atomization of the American and in general the Western industrialized countries of the worker is something that I think has seriously damaged the ability of the left or of unions or however you want to define broad workers movement to organize themselves. Of course, I think this has led to one of the most dire couple of decades for the left as we face ever growing problems. I think the ever encroaching nature of capitalism as it begins to eat itself and as the imperial core begins to fall apart, I think the left will be increasingly faced with the reality of its powerlessness as it stands. And I think the state of the left as it stands now is defined by its powerlessness, at least in America and certainly the UK, in many ways Europe. In light of that, I think that there is a lot of energy put towards articulating differences within the socialist movement, which I think is a useful project insofar as it is to differentiate socialists from liberals and our tactics from one another. That is to say, I think a plurality of approaches on the left is good, but electoral politics has offered us essentially nothing. I say all this to a point that I think any modern left movement should be focused on combating the atomization of the American worker, of the worker in general, world workers, and working on organizing the working class broadly and in specific in each workplace. I think, again, the concept of left is fuzzy, and I think trying to identify it as a dog chasing a mail truck. It can never be captured. And so I don't think that there's anything particularly politically useful about the left, except insofar as you can identify yourself socially to other people. So I guess all that is to say, ideological differentiations are going to be useless so long as we're powerless. And I think the first step in any left movement has to be building worker power, organizing your workplace, and focusing on democratizing the workplace, because I think similar, frankly, to the bourgeois revolution happening first in the workplace and then in the state, I think the politics will follow the economics. And I think that's an important point in terms of our strategy going forward. The left. I guess that's it.
Henry, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks so much. I grew up my name's Henry, you see in pronouns. I grew up down the street in Newton Center. A lot of socialists from Newton. And the last time I was on this campus, 3 years ago, I was here with the BC grad students, and I got escorted off by the police. So it's very nice. So it's very welcome. So it's good to be back. No cops tonight. So, well, I don't know. Maybe you guys are CIA screws. You never know. So. Thanks so much. So I'm a rideshare driver. I'm a organizer. I run Mass Drivers United, which is a minority union, and I'm also a founder and editor of Working Mass, which is our DSA labor blog. And I think the left wing of the DSA that is making Tom uncomfortable. So I'm so grateful for this invitation, and this is a super important topic that we. It's so important that we discuss this. But I want to take us away from the abstract and towards all the exciting developments that are taking place politically on the left and in the labor movement as we rebuild and revitalize both. So let's look at the class struggle in history, and point our comments or remarks directly at the class struggle today and tomorrow. So for my own contribution, I'm a Bolshevik, I'll be drawing on Bolshevism. Understanding the relationship between left and the classes of our society, especially the proletariat, is extremely important for all of us here, everyone struggling for the emancipation of humanity. The division of society into classes is a fact, regardless of whether we're aware of it. As we know, or maybe you don't know, but as we should know, the term left wing comes from the French Revolution, where the progressive section sat on the left wing of the assembly, the left side. But while the term left comes from one of the most classical bourgeois revolutions, we can easily find a left and apply the concept to revolutions past, present, and future. I mean, I don't think that fuzzy and relative are the same thing, right? Where's the left in this room, right? My left's over here, the audience's left is over there. It's definite, but it's relative. In the classical class struggles between patrician and plebeian, Roman and Christian, noble and peasant, feudal and bourgeois, slave state and free state, we can definitely identify a left wing and a right wing, and also map out the philosophizing section of the left wing and the wider class or sections of the masses that they gain their support from. When we come to the mature capitalist era, we are of course dealing with the socialist movement and the proletarian class, as well as other, the progressive movement, the wider, whatever that means today. Middle classes, right? But most specifically with the socialist movement and the proletarian class. And Marx and Engels faced the revolt of the proletariat not as a socialist prescription, but as an established fact. Workers were revolting. The Lyon silk workers, the Silesian weavers, the Manchester textile workers were rising up against their bosses, against the capitalist system, years before the Communist Manifesto came out, before Marxism took the scene, or just as it was taking the scene. And what Marx and Engels sought to do, not just through their writing, but also what we often forget, their tangible labor organizing and socialist organizing, was to spread the workers' movement, to spread the socialist movement, and to bring the two together. I think one of the most dangerous and disorganizing ideas in the socialist movement today is the idea that socialist consciousness grows spontaneously from the workers' movement. As we just heard, that the politics follows the economics, that the workers' movement evolves into the socialist movement. I think this is really disorientating and wrong. As Kautsky and Lenin point out, socialism and the class struggle arise side by side and not one out of the other. Each arises under its own different conditions. And for socialism, the conditions are scientific inquiry, which comes from the bourgeois intelligentsia, right? Including Marx and Engels themselves, who were sons of the bourgeoisie. So socialist consciousness, socialism, is something that is introduced to the workers' movement from outside, from without. So today's left, the socialist left specifically, of all the historical lefts, does indeed have its roots in a section of the bourgeoisie. In broad terms, success of the socialist movement, just going back to Marx and Engels, it's sort of this dumbed down formula. The success in the 19th and 20th centuries were the result of socialists reaching the workers and workers reaching the socialists and the merging of the two movements. We saw that most profoundly in the Russian Revolution. But I think the conditions were very, very different today. We don't have Tsarist police spies, locking us up. I've never been sent to Siberia. So I want to turn to another Bolshevik organizer who is organizing in a liberal capitalist country with a labor movement that's similar to our society today. In fact, right here in this country, and that's William Z. Foster. Now, I'm not endorsing this entire life. He ended up a Stalinist, but he did spend his lifetime fighting to connect the socialist movement with the American labor movement. And this past year, as I've been sort of looking for sources to learn how to organize drivers, how to organize app workers, these hyper-atomized workers that we're all concerned with, I've really found a lot to learn from Foster, and particularly the principles and program of the Trade Union Education League, which I encourage everyone to study. The tool, it's a cool name, tool, makes sense for workers. And he beautifully pens the relationship between class and the left, or more specifically socialists and the proletariat. I have a long quote, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically he says one of the greatest achievements is the clear understanding of the proposition that the fate of all labor organization in every country depends primarily upon the activities of a minute minority of clear-sighted, enthusiastic militants, and he really means socialists and a wider layer, but socialists for sure, scattered throughout the great organized masses of sluggish workers. These live spirits are the natural head of the working class, the driving force of the labor movement. They're the only ones who really understand what the labor struggle means and who have practical plans for its prosecution. I love this next line. Touched by the divine fire of proletarian revolt, they are the ones who furnish inspiration and guidance to the groping masses. They do the bulk of the thinking, working, and fighting of the labor struggle, etc., etc. Basically, he says, you know, where these militants, when they function and do their job, that's when you have a flourishing labor movement. And when they fail to so function, the whole labor movement withers and stagnates. So they're really the key, right? This is basically the vanguard conception, but applied to the labor movement, because we're not just talking about the left, we're talking about the working class as well. So we see, at least from the Bolshevik perspective, that not only is the socialist movement impotent if it can't find a bridge to the workers, which we all know, but the workers' movement is impotent if its left wing doesn't provide militant and foresighted leadership. I wrote my thesis on, it's called The War on American Socialism, which hopefully I'm going to publish in Working Mass this spring. And in part of my I look at counter-revolution, and one thing that I learned, which is very interesting, is it's not just the Bolsheviks who see the revolutionary socialist leadership as the key, the linchpin. The CIA and the FBI also identified them as the linchpin and focused their persecution, spying, assassination, everything under the sun on groups like the Communist Party, the Black Panthers, and the Socialist Workers' Party. In order, one more minute. Can I have a 2 minutes? Sure. Yeah. So anyway, let's turn to, forget about my thesis. Let's turn to the class struggle today. Right? Most people, at least in this country, don't work in massive industrial factories. We shouldn't forget about, you know, the rest of the proletariat around the world. But I think the concept's still valid, but we should update it. You know, if you read Jacobin, you're going to read about this incessant whining about how the left can't reach workers, the hopeless middle-class nature of our socialist movement. And there's truth to this, but when we put it in the proper perspective, I think we find more hope than pessimism. So first, if the nature of the socialist movement is the bourgeoisie, the left bourgeoisie striving to the working class, then that's a normal place to be. It's going to start off from one class and move to another. And second, we've had this massive expansion of education, not just the sons of the rich bourgeoisie, but also middle class and even working class youth. Yeah, we know there's obstacles to education, but this, if it's scientific inquiry, that's the wellspring of socialism. Many of our youth today do have access to college. The same proletarians who 100 years ago were self-educating and joining the socialist movement, a lot of them go to college today, and then we count them as middle class. So I think that's part of it. And then just to the worker struggle today, I think both in the spontaneous organizing and concerted organizing that's being led by socialists. Here's a quote from, I wrote a piece about the pavement coffee house workers for working mass, which I think prefigures the Starbucks developments. In the historical development of the class struggle, often the consciousness of smaller sections of a class shift prior to the class as a whole. The developments of these sections anticipate the mode and tempo of class struggle in the next period, which is to say the ideas of class struggle and socialism are permeating the workforce through millennial and Gen Z employees. And the job of the socialist movement and the labor movement is to grab the bellows and fuel this fire with the oxygen of organizing. And also in the rideshare drivers movement, we find that it's, which is very different. We can talk more about this in a bit, but where you have just atomization, drivers hardly have relationships with each other. You have to have this cadre with a clear vision that has to will a union into existence. And who's doing that work? It's socialists, including myself. So ultimately, capitalism is not going to be overcome. It will be overthrown. The proletarian revolt, worker fight back is inevitable, but socialist revolution is not. It has to be consciously organized. And
Thank you, Henry, is that the stopping point for now?
yeah, sure. I'll just conclude that anyone who can't or won't reach the working classes take it.
Thank you. And what would you like to give your opening remarks to, please?
Yeah, thanks. Mine should be like 12 minutes, so sorry if I'm jumping 2 minutes extra. We cannot talk about what the left should do regarding class until we address what the left is currently doing to divide the working class and prevent class consciousness. Today, the positive task of building a socialist movement is conditioned by the need for the negative task of making conscious the left's own reactionary and opportunistic role regarding class. Today, the left serves to generate ideology that tails the most powerful capitalist political party in the world, the Democrats, and therefore unconsciously reproduces the Democrats' strategic outlook. The main ideological project of the Democrats is to divide the working class, mainly along lines of the culture wars, in order to ensure consistent voting blocks for Democratic candidates and to keep workers from consolidating an autonomous class interest and potentially rise up against the capitalist state. By and large, the left functions as the unwitting shock troops of this conservative agenda, operating often as its most radical advocates. Take, for example, the recent truckers' convoy in Ottawa. As soon as the protests began, the establishment media set out on a smear campaign to portray it as a bunch of racists, neo-Nazis, and terrorists. Of course, this virtually had no bearing on the reality of the convoy, which comprised a hodgepodge of workers, most of them not truckers, and their families, most of whom were vaccinated, but simply fed up with further intrusions of the biomedical surveillance state. The point is not simply to uphold any given movement made up of workers, like the Freedom Convoy or even the Trump movement, but rather to treat them as a serious expression of working class discontent in the absence of leftist leadership. More often than not, however, the left simply rejects these movements on progressive capitalism's own terms. Rather than point out the deceitful propaganda agenda of the liberal media against the truckers, the left became its most zealous spokesperson, disavowing the convoy before even examining it and coming up with contrived class analyses about how truckers do not qualify as workers because some of them own trucks and therefore merit the stamp petty bourgeoisie, as if this was what Marx had in mind as class analysis. We cannot understand the left's reactionary conservative role regarding class without addressing the preponderance of radlibism on the left today. In effect, radlib hysterics only exacerbate the polarization of the working class by upping the ante on the pseudo-political culture wars. For example, raising Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables to the specter of fascists. The endlessly repeated turn to the PC identity politics of race, gender, sexuality serves as the highest symptom of neoliberalism, which has narrowed the conception of politics to the competition between interest groups, lobbying for greater recognition from the capitalist state. Leftists bend over backwards to avoid accusations of racism, sexism, and homophobia, often taking it up upon themselves to prove their woke credentials, as though this were the historical task of the left. By treating the culture wars as politics, the left avoids its single task, as Marx has conceived it, to organize the working class for socialist revolution, increasingly remote today. Instead, moral blackmail has become the primary tactic of the left, pressuring individuals to take the correct position on current events and tabloid scandals, which are deemed as pressing emergencies demanding immediate action. Capitalism, like global warming, is not perpetrated. It is not the conspiracy of supervillains. Rather, capitalism dominates everyone, although some have a higher interest in maintaining it than others. If you want to solve global warming, you start by taking global humanity as the only potential subject of change. If you don't want to solve global warming, you cut back on annual flights, tell your friends how evil Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are, and let your unflushed piss sit in the toilet, and thereby assume the individual as your subject, thus adopting the neoliberal idea that there's no such thing as society, but only individuals, to paraphrase Margaret Thatcher. Consumer politics assumes that we can come together only as friends and taste communities and not as a universal class. Historically, the left spurned such petty bourgeois nihilism. Now, the left has become its most self-righteous victim. What we have seen, especially since the 60s New Left, is the treatment of capitalism and class as a moral category. Above all, this takes the form of workerism, treating workers as good and employers as bad. The Marxist historical view of class as temporary and subject to change has been replaced with a sentimental attachment to the plight of the worker, treating the working class in a fundamentally conservative way as a morally upright constituency to be preserved, rather than to abolish itself as a class through socialist revolution. Marxism, however, understood the capitalist conflict between capital and labor as a historical contradiction, mediating all of social reproduction, not as a conflict between one group of people and another as identifiable sections of the population, workers versus capitalists. Rather, these were dialectical categories that subsequent bourgeois sociology reduced to static demographics, with indices like income, which the left has adopted and proudly championed as scientific and fact-based politics. Marxism's point was that the conflict between capital and labor permeated all of society. What made the proletarian working class a potential revolutionary class was not that they evaded this contradiction, but that they embodied it. Their position in social reproduction compelled them to simultaneously fight for their bourgeois right, or the right to the full value of their labor, and to fight to abolish bourgeois right altogether through socialist revolution. The only true subjectivity of the proletariat class interest was an unrealized, future positive subjectivity, not some inner moral superiority to the bourgeoisie in the present. Nowadays, the left's treatment of class serves to prolong the condition of proletarianization by concealing its regressive character. Things were not always so confused. Historically, the left and the working class were actually conjoined. In the 19th century, there developed a Marxist left that recognized its origins as independent of the proletarian working class, and rather part of the ideological tradition of the radical bourgeoisie and liberalism going back to the 18th century. In the period of the Second International, around the turn of the 20th century, Marxists like Karl Kautsky and Vladimir Lenin formalized a conception of the Socialist Party as the merger of the proletariat and the radical socialist intelligentsia, based on the educative role of the latter. Today, the left is embarrassed by the thought of leading workers, and instead condescends to them by tokenizing their class identity and celebrating them just as they are. By refusing to teach them, the left tacitly assumes that workers are not interested, willing, or able of being challenged and tasked with changing the world. Again, the left accomplishes the capitalist propaganda for them. In Marx's time, when the contradiction of capitalism between labor and capital appeared transparent to everyone, history appeared as the history of class struggle. Today, with the covering up of this antagonism by the Bonapartist capitalist state and its default ideology of proto-fascist cross-class integration, history now appears as the history of gangs and rackets. We might say that in the era of neoliberalism and woke capitalism, history now appears as the history of race wars. Another way that the left liquidates its historical leadership of the working class is by promoting the bribes of the capitalist state itself. The liberal political scientist Frances Fox Pittman wrote her first book on the welfare state, entitled Regulating the Poor, The Functions of Public Welfare, which helped answer the question of why the anti-capitalist struggle dissipated in the 20th century by highlighting the conservative role of the welfare state. She rightly showed that the ascendant welfare state directly quelled the working class radical movement, namely by partially ameliorating the capital-labor contradiction, so as to cover it up and continue its existence. The Bernie-crat left falls below these liberal insights when it one-sidedly champions the welfare state as though that were socialism, forgetting that the modern welfare state was first introduced by the arch-conservative Otto von Bismarck as a way of breaking up socialist hegemony over the working class by appeasing them directly through the imperialist state. In conclusion, the left today takes up class in terms set by the capitalist parties, namely culture wars, welfarism, statistics, begging the question if they are really a left at all. This is not simply an issue of wrong ideas, but also one of social and political organization. Without an independent socialist party deliberately resisting integration into progressive capitalist politics, the left is doomed to funnel its well-meaning efforts into the only political entities that exist. Instead of leftists, what we have today is radical intellectuals, including Platypus itself. More often than not, they're there to keep workers in line and enforce the proper petty bourgeois etiquette of the day, whether that be PC identity politics, spinning neoliberal austerity as the moral duty of individuals to have less children, or upholding a counter-revolutionary narrative of slow but steady progress throughout the 20th century, capped by the civil rights movement. The separation of class theory in its practice is not made palpable today, so long as the left remains in denial and continues to uphold workers' struggles as laid out by the Democrats. What is needed is a left that is independent of these opportunistic forces and guarded against co-optation. The millennial left and the Zoomer left has failed to meet this need. Our task now is to cultivate the soil of the next generation. Platypus exists to remind us that this will require not simply opposing the right, but actually pouring cold water on the zombie left, who otherwise fail to face up to their own impotency.
Thank you. Exactly 10 minutes. I feel like you got some good kind of opposing views in the opening remarks. So let's take 3 minutes each, and you can respond to things that other panelists have said. Do you mind if I start with you, Tom?
Go ahead.
Please.
Okay. Thanks, Luke. Well, sort of, first of all, in response to Will, I want to ask, well, and Will has a restates something that generationally I will have a lot of sympathy with, which is with a discomfort with identity politics, and a wanting, a desire to go back to sort of class, to a good old Marxist class politics. And the question that I would want to ask is that actually possible? That in this particular moment, this particular country, at this particular time of history, people's experience of capitalism and of class processes are so mediated by race, among other things, that that it's really impossible to basically conduct a class politics without incorporating identity into it at a basic level. I just my wife's oldest, dearest friend came to New York, and we had and the two couples got hotel rooms in Harlem, and we went to the Apollo Theater. And one of the things that was extraordinarily clear there is that the class change in the Harlem community, which is the label gentrification, has completely transformed Harlem. It's also absolutely decisive in terms of how people are experiencing the day-to-day life and how capitalism is affecting them. And you can't separate, even if that process of gentrification is at roots a capitalist economic one, you can't separate the way that is lived from which is very much as a racial process. So that's the question I wanted to ask Will. Sam, I wanted to ask about electoral politics, and one of the things that labor movements and labor advocates are doing increasingly is trying to pursue economic issues through political legislation, and therefore having to do electoral politics. So I'm very involved in what's called the Raise Up Massachusetts coalition, which is working getting earned sick time, paid family medical leave, and we're going to have sort of a millionaire's tax voted on in November. And please, everybody who's a Massachusetts voter, please vote for the mass fair share amendment this coming November.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
I just want to give other people a chance to answer your question. Sorry. Did you have another quick question?
Oh yeah, and I wanted to just quickly ask Henry whether the recomposition of the working class from being primarily industrial working class actually necessitated any kind of change in Marxist or socialist politics or not, or whether basically things could continue as before.
All right. Shall we go in order as before, or is anyone really itching to answer Thomas' question?
So primarily I want to respond first to Tom in terms of the utility of electoral politics. I think for something like passing an amendment to get the millionaire's tax is an excellent use of electoral politics in the sense of I think it can produce gains that will help working people in the short term and that will in general make life easier to live. I don't think that we can legislate or vote our way into socialism. In light of that, I sort of move towards Henry's comment in terms of how I envision socialism arising, frankly. And I say it starts by democratizing the workplace because I do not think that there is an alternative we can undertake meaningfully. I say that in the sense of I really question how a revolutionary body in the modern America could take power. I mean, the coercive forces of the state have never been more powerful. They've never been more involved. They've never had more information about individuals. I think that the protests last summer showed, I mean, that they will crack down as hard as they feel necessary, and we will all forget about it within a few months. I say all in the sense of our collective social consciousness. And to that point, when I say that the left is fuzzy, I don't precisely mean that you don't know what I mean when I say the left right now. You know exactly what I mean. But tomorrow it might be different. It might, in somewhere else, it might be different. I think that it's temporally and geographically located and constantly changing, which is why I think it's both useless to define and not a really good political coalition. Which again just points more towards the fact that I don't think there will be in the current institutional configuration a useful socialist politics in terms of creating a socialist American government. That being said, I think the best thing that can happen in the short and medium term for workers is, again, a democratized workplace that will hopefully eventually lead to a broader socialist polity born out of a workers' movement that, of course, I agree, should and must be led by militant socialists, union leaders, and organizers. And I think that socialists should be deeply, deeply involved in the workers' movement. And in fact, I think what I'm saying more than anything is that that should be our focus. I think, again, electoral work can be important for ameliorating the conditions. I don't think it's likely to change them. So I guess in finality, I pose the question, if you think that like an insurgency or a revolution is the way to socialism, are you prepared to have yourself everyone you know and your entire family killed, basically. I mean, that's the reality that you look at. I mean, it's horrible, but that's what I mean. Insurgencies don't
Is that a question
succeed
of me?
in general. Sorry, I mean, I think
It assumes I like my family.
it sounds great. Yeah. You know, but I think that the point being, as a student of political violence, I can tell you, insurgencies don't usually succeed, and then when they fail, it has dire consequences for everyone involved. And I think that we need to grapple seriously.
Thank you very much. Henry, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, yeah, it turns out when you try and overthrow the capitalist class, it's dangerous. Yeah, no doubt. Well, yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'm the only optimist on the stage. Like, I don't know if people have been paying attention, but the DSA we ran, just in the greater Boston, we ran 12 socialists. You know, not all of them are revolutionary socialists, whatever. Some of them are. But we ran 12 socialists and we ran a whole slate in Somerville. We won the first Boston city councilor who's a social, and she's a radical motherfucker. And she won, we're winning. There more than 10 Starbucks in the last 2 months, more than 10 Starbucks have self-organized just in the state, right? So, I mean, that fills me with unbounded optimism. I think, there's a lot that's been said that's interesting. We're not going to vote our way into socialism, but it's in elections and it's a standard Marxist conception. There's some Engels quotes I can share with you, but that elections are an incredibly important, it's almost like the face of the movement. Doesn't mean there's not opportunists. I mean, I think with Will, you're definitely, I mean, maybe we're using a different definition of the left. Yeah, obviously there's loads of pathetic graduates who want us to recycle more. That's not how I was using it. I just meant more the socialist movement and maybe just a little bit outside of it. But Marxism is not class reductionism. I believe it's a Marcuse quote, all social relations are class relations, okay? Gender, race, are related, are class relations. They're not proletarian relations, but they are, we can draw a connection to the means of production, not the factory, but the means of production of racial animosity, et cetera, et cetera. And I can expand on that more. And then, yeah, Tom, I mean, there's, and yeah, I mean, I was laughing. I read the canon, the fight for American Trotskyism, or whatever the book is. We should make middle-class people go out and recruit workers. I think that's awesome. There's so many people who show up to every meeting and just run their mouth and never provide anything to the movement. And meanwhile, there's millions of people who voted for Bernie Sanders and we're not going and reaching them. I'm not going to cry. My parents are doctors. It's not like I'm, a salt of the earth proletarian, but I go out and recruit workers. And organize them. So, I don't shed any tears for, sort of dilettantes who can't, grow a spine and go, talk to people of color, go into a Dunkin' Donuts, talk to the workers there. It's, and we should be providing training and support, but, ultimately those people, if you can't do that, then it's not the movement for you, go read a book, go write a book or whatever. So, and I think that's the attitude we need to have, because some people will spend their whole lives showing up to meetings like this and never do anything productive for the movement for the revolution. So, and then, yeah, I think we have to have a more positive, absolutely, we're seeing with Uber and Lyft, they're weaponizing the race, class, gender, disability, even analysis to take driver's rights away. It's highly cynical. I'm sure maybe you've seen, what's the movie? The one about Care, where she's kidnapping people. I forget the title, but right. But also these are expressions of marginalized people. So I think there's an identity politics from above, a cynical one. The Hillary Clinton vote for me because I'm a woman, and there's an identity politics from below. And I don't think we can it's so annoying when it gets used against us, but we also have to have an affirmative stance about fighting for the equality of everyone, and uplifting voices of the marginalized without playing into, I mean, there totally is this workerism where, every union that's ever had a meeting, they get a worker and they groom them, they prep them, and then that worker speaks. And then they're, the audience is like, oh yeah, the worker's like leading it, but it's really some staffer. So, yeah, we should realize. Thanks so much. No, I'm done. I mean, optimism is good. Like, we're winning, we're doing awesome, and like, let's do the work. And I actually have an article coming out tomorrow, so that talks about a lot of this stuff.
Where's the article coming from?
On working men's.
Yeah, just briefly so we can get to Q&A. So to answer Tom's question about my discomfort with identity politics, it's not about discomfort so much as what is an expression of, and what it includes in terms of, again, the task of the left as socialists and Marxists historically understood it. And so, in a sense, its pervasiveness today is the result of the failure of socialists. It's the failure of the revolution, it's the failure of the movement for socialism. In its wake, what we get is tailing the kind of ideological struggle of capitalist parties like Democrats, who use and prop up identity politics, as we've seen, not just as an overlap with the left, but actually as a way of discounting. I mean, the most prominent example is the Trump movement. It's at the level of explanation and understanding of how the world works. Something like racism, anti-racism was used to understand, to explain the phenomenon of millions of people not voting for Hillary Clinton. Why did they not vote for her? Because they're all racist. I mean, it's hyperbolic, but that was more or less the narrative that the Democratic Party gave, that the left ate that shit up. They ate that shit up. So to me, that's where it's actually a problem at the level of ideological tailism and opportunism. I guess the only thing I'll say for now, I'll also, well, two things briefly. I feel like one difference I think noting behind the surface is the question of majority versus minority. So I think Tom has a conception of democracy coming maybe from, especially the new left, SDS kind of conception, perhaps, but versus this idea of a minority of radical Bolshevik tendency of militants. And so I just wanted to bring that up so that maybe later discussion, you all can talk about that. And the last thing is optimism. Yeah, it does seem like, Henry, you're kind of the only optimist on the panel. So I guess the question of, who are these socialists that you're saying are winning the battles? Like, I literally don't know, who are you talking about? Who are the Bolsheviks today? Is it the DSA? Like, how, it's hard to square this idea of, you're saying socialists winning battles, when, as you put it, historically Marx and Engels kind of brought together this ongoing labor movement and this socialist ideology. Today we don't really have either, at least not in any kind of political way. So I just wanted to bring that up again.
Great, thank you all for excellent presentations and responses. But now let's open it up for audience Q&A. I think we'll prioritize the people in person because I don't think there's anyone on the Zoom call at the moment. So please raise your hand, and I don't know if that silver microphone is the best one to use or if there's another one we can pass around, but there are plenty of microphones, so please come to the front, I guess, to use one.
I mean, you can just speak up. It's not, we're like 20 feet. It's bad the audience can't see the tremendous audience. I mean, the viewers can't see the tremendous audience.
I say small is actually huge. So I guess I'll ask the lead-off question in case anyone, while you give you guys a moment to think. So what would people say the difference between organizing as a class and organizing as workers means to each of you, or to anyone who wants to answer that? Because we had the workers' movement, kind of workers' democracy, or worker organizing of workplaces. And that seemed to tie to class in some way, but I don't know if anyone would like to clarify or disagree with anyone else's conception of class who spoke on this panel.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear from you, Henry. So, like, it seemed like Sam and Tom certainly had ideas of a workers' movement or worker organizing of either unions or workplaces as potentially at least leading in the direction of socialism, if not right away. But I was wondering if you kind of ascertained any of their ideas about class and whether their ideas about workers' movements would lead to a kind of class consciousness or class-based movement, or if that's something you think about at all.
It's a tough question to wrap my head around. I mean, we need, like, I'm a professional union organizer. Like, yeah, we need unions. I mean, I think my point is that you don't get to social, like, if you go out and organize unions and organize workers, it doesn't magically evolve like a Pokemon into a socialist movement. And I love Pokemon. So you need both, right? And Marx and Engels were building a labor movement, and they were working with unions, they were working with socialist groups, they were working to merge the two. But I think the point of the Bolshevik experience is that, and I think a group like Solidarity, what they really lean away from, which I strongly disagree with, is this idea that first you do one, if workers are involved in class struggle, eventually they'll spontaneously become socialists. No, you need to do both agitation amongst the workers and what we're doing here today, propaganda amongst the intelligentsia, recruiting socialists in the one-on-one. If you never have the socialist wing and it's not functioning, and functioning, first amongst itself and then within the workers' movement and recruiting, the best layers of the workers' movement to it, then the labor movement is going to remain inept and conservative.
I guess my question still is like, what's the labor movement today and the socialist movement today, other than compared to historically when they were both vehemently independent of the state. So both the parties themselves and the labor movements didn't sort of start as wings of the state or as props of capitalist parties. But that can't be said today of what today would pass as, I don't know, the socialist movement and or the workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of a question, as with almost anything or everything in Marxism, it's really a question of tendencies, rather than something established, right? The labor movement in the United States used to be like one of them, like would be to the right of the CIA and international policy. And over the last 20 years, it's become more progressive. And there's like, maybe people didn't know in this room that 3 of the largest unions in the state are run by socialists. Are they hardcore Marxists? No.
But they're tiny. I mean, they've been decimated over the last several decades. Labor unions. They're,
But the Mass Teachers Association has 100,000 members. That's not tiny. That's just in this state. And they're led by leftists. The Mass Nurses Association is a fighting union. I forget it, of tens of thousands of members, 30 or 60,000. It's also led by a DSA member. The AFT Mass is, again, a huge union, including the Boston Teachers Union, which has tens of thousands of members. It's led by a socialist. So
Could I ask a clarifying question? Would you say that those unions are organized around class in any way?
they're unions. Yeah. What else is a union? It's a worker.
Certainly they're workers.
Well, there are employers.
so what's the
unions.
difference
There's such thing
between-
as employers.
That's true. I just.
Okay, I mean, this, I guess, maybe what you're saying, because this is kind of a important question, because if the examples of sort of go-to means we're looking at are, teachers and nurses who are highly credentialized, have means of, artificially suppressing supply, labor, doesn't that then mean we cannot extrapolate organizing principles from them onto broader workers' unions as a whole? Like, it's like organized professionals, you know, this is not highly credentialized with the secular society. It's the same as rights regardless of
Well, we're certainly not going to extrapolate it from discussing in this room, but I think there's some validity to what you're saying, but I always, economic determinism, like the teachers union didn't, the left wing of the MTA and the AFT didn't win just magically because teachers are credentialed. Like people were organizing for decades, socialists were organizing for decades in those unions to beat out the right wing and take them over.
But this is a leadership question then, within the union, not a question of the union in the first place. It's easy to make a union get a better employee. That's the answer.
Is it? I've never.
It's certainly easier because you can't replace labor. Right? Now, organizing McDonald's is a lot harder than organizing us.
I mean, I guess, but I think what you're talking about is it's just a question of, I mean, maybe it's a different strategy, but I think the principle is the same, right? I mean, in the sense of you're organizing a workplace, of course, yes, as you say, the labor is more replaceable, but at the same time, I mean, I would argue that the costs of training a new labor force, even if it's a McDonald's, even if it's a rideshare, I mean, those are costs. I mean, rideshare is not also, it's not exclusively people who are doing it, and I mean, you can speak to this more, I think, acutely, but a lot of people are, renting their cars from Uber, they have loans, and I think that those connections make it difficult to just arbitrarily replace workers. I think it's more difficult than you make it out to be.
I mean, I assume who works in restaurants, who arbitrarily replace workers.
Yeah.
It's
incredibly hard to organize anything, right? And I guess what I'm saying is, I don't really understand your point, or like the idea that because some unions are, slightly easier or substantially easier, that therefore they don't count. The real problem is that the labor movement as a whole hasn't even been trying to organize large sections of the workforce. If you look at the percentage spent of union budgets, of all union budgets on new organizing, it's like less than 10%. I mean, it's totally insignificant.
But that didn't come from nowhere. Now I'm showing my age and forgetfulness and not remembering exactly when John Sweeney took over the AFL-CIO.
The right wing had to drive out the left wing, had to drive out the communists, who were the ones who grew the.
No. This is you're talking about the 30s and I'm talking about the 1990s when sort of Sweeney and this thing called New Voices or whatever that took over that elected the new leadership to the AFL-CIO, and there was very much a commitment to new organizing, and the tragedy is that actually didn't work. That those resources were put into it, and whether it's due to incompetence or whether it's due to objective understandable difficulties, we can debate. But sort of union organizing has sort of actually been less successful, and the money has stopped going into it because there have been so few successes. There's an interesting study that was done. Unions are getting actually much better at working out where they can win. So when you have union elections, they are actually being won uniformly to a greater extent than they were previously. But there are fewer and fewer places sort of organizing big employers. It's a real problem. It's sort of like there's effects, there's success in sort of niche organizing, that's sort of like graduate students, also credentialed employers, workers. But in terms of organizing sort of big employers with traditionally working class. It's been unsuccessful. The joke is that basically if current trends continue, the percentage of union election victories will become closer to 100% as the number of union elections comes close to zero.
So what if this notion of success and victory and winning? What do you guys make of the claim Will made that maybe these activities are only shock troops for the Democrats? Like if you're winning elections, if you're organizing workplaces, if you're growing unions, what would be a victory beyond that? Or do you disagree with that characterization?
I think a union in and of itself is a victory. That union contracts, successful collective bargaining is in and of itself a victory because it just improves a lot of workers on a simple basic level. And I don't
What
think
about Nazis?
What about Nazis?
Yeah, what about Nazis? What about regimes like the Nazis, which there were organized unions?
well, I mean, that's I don't know if that's your.
No, come on.
I mean, I
It's a
guess I
serious
would say
question.
that
Yes,
like
not every union.
okay,
it's a
well then I
sincere
guess I
question.
could solidify it on the basis of, yeah, I mean, I think that so long as there are unions that are operating on the basis of collective bargaining to increase worker power towards, worker democracy, I think then I have a hard time seeing that as a failure in any way or as not a success. I mean, and again, I don't see in America a fascist workers movement. And I mean, in the sense of you brought up Trump a few times, but that's not a workers movement. Like, I mean, the primary supporters of Trump were like middle class people, were people of, like upper middle class people who were, frankly, owners of capital for the most part. I think, of course, obviously there were a number of workers who voted for Trump, but I think it's dishonest in many ways to call it a working class movement. And so in that sense, when I say that a union in itself is a victory, it's because, I think it's fair to assume in this current context that if a union is being won in a workplace, broadly speaking, it is to improve the lot of the workers towards more democratic accountability from the bosses. Again, I would also argue that unions are one part of the strategy. And I think building cooperative workplaces and not hierarchical workplaces is also something that we should be working towards and supporting. And I think that's harder and more complicated. But again, I think as Henry said, just because it's difficult doesn't mean that new innovations can't be undertaken or that it can't be done. I think what the left or what the working class movement needs right now is organizational power, which we desperately lack. And I think that's the important thing.
Oh, no, I'm just.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm generally sympathetic to your diagnosis of the current progressive left movement, although I'm curious about what you think, prescriptively, like, I do think the Bernie movement to decommodify kind of healthcare and other kind of resources, his housing plan, I didn't read all of it. It was supposed to be somewhat substantial. So do you think that his kind of the broader movement to decommodify kind of the basic means of subsistence, do you have a fairly cynical view of that as well, or do you think that that could be still somewhat helpful for pushing the movement forward? Because I'll leave that.
I think it's a question of who is doing what, not what. Just like unions, you can have any sort of union on the spectrum of left or right politics. They were called National Socialists. It's very much appealing to workers' interests. That's how they rose. And so, yeah, I think something like well, I'm not sure what this language of decommodify, I guess nationalizing healthcare, yeah, nationalizing, again, can be done in the name of any kind of political interest. And so therefore it becomes a question of who's doing it and really what is the goal? What is the trajectory? I feel like we've been talking about the class side of class and the left for the last 30 minutes. And I think even assuming the union is class, the union is work. Workers are, you just sort of like, there's this, you know, of course they are leftists or something, like kind of conflating, taking for granted. But I think what we're leaving out is that historically, at least, there was a left that would actually lead these movements. And so, yeah, under the leadership of a movement for socialism, a socialist party, there was and there would be a very different meaning to organizing healthcare, nationalizing healthcare as part of the movement towards liberation of society. But under the current, you know, Bernie Sanders, I don't see that kind of leadership. I don't think the question of left, as it was historically meant, really applied.
Well, Will, to your latter point there, and this is something you mentioned as well, this idea that historically the left and the working class were going to join. In movements, eventually they did, but you can also read the history of the German socialist movement, the Russian socialist movement, the British socialist movement, the early American socialist movement, saying to themselves, shit, we need to go reach the workers. And then they do, and they eventually join together. So it's a question of process. I think it's fantastic that millions of people, even if they don't understand what socialism is, even if, you know, they are really excited about, you know, welfare reforms, I think it's a step forward and creates favorable conditions for organizing that people were excited about Bernie Sanders, right? That doesn't mean Bernie Sanders is the solution. It doesn't mean that calling for the nationalization of healthcare is going to solve all our problems, but it undeniably creates a more favorable territory for the left. And 90,000 people, many not active, but 90,000 Americans, more than that probably, have joined DSA. Many of them are social democrats. Some of them are opportunists. But as an involved member, I know a lot of them are aspiring to be or moving towards revolutionary socialism. And I think that's rad. And I've been a socialist for 10 years. When I first started, you know, flyering at UCLA on Bruin Walk, I literally had somebody spit in my face. And, you know, we would have some good conversations, but, you know, mostly we got cold shoulders. Now, more and more of our generation is open to socialism. And yeah, unfortunately, it's more meme posting and, you know, some rad lib, you know, wokeism than it is, you know, going into the workplace, reading the theory, et cetera, really getting organized. But I mean, just the last 10 years have been, for me, just more and more favorable opportunities. Again, just 10 stores, 10 Starbucks just in the city, self-organized because they're socialists. They're a bunch of young socialist baristas, and they filed NLRB petitions. That's a tremendous start, and I think it's a bellwether for what's to come in the next 5 years of class struggle.
Yeah, I thought there was something.
Sorry, it's okay we jump in. I think so. For somebody of my generation, the recent explosion of DSA is extraordinary. I mean, it's sort of like, is it? Have you reached 100,000 yet, or?
I don't know. I actually don't know. I know it's over
2016 is like the real explosion, right?
No, it's continued.
I mean, like 2016 was the real explosion.
But it's actually go on. I mean, sort of, we can they're having. There's been recently a sort of a leveling off in growth, I think, which was inevitable because it happened. But the growth that was occurred before it was extraordinary, and I would never have predicted it. And one of the things that's interesting is the class composition of that membership, and it is very young. So DSA basically shifted from being about like 90% over 60 or something like that to being 90% over under 28. So it's a very young cohort, and it represents, I think, the experience of a generation of young, educated people who were told growing up if they worked hard and did their homework and everything else, they were going to get access to a reasonable career. And that the economy has changed to such an extent that that's no longer guaranteed. And I would argue that GSA's growth is based on a milieu of educated young people who are legitimately and understandably frustrated about the lack of opportunities that they face. And that's different from the working class as I and other old fogies used to understand it. And so I think it's an interesting question about whether the viability of socialist politics in the future, but also the identity of socialist politics and working class politics.
I have one more question. No, one thing.
Yeah, so Henry, you're talking about the optimism for Bernie, just to go back a little bit. And like, yeah, that's something that the left has like really taken up and like has like been very optimistic about. But I think like in that same election cycle, the reaction to like support for like Trump, because like, yeah, there's optimism to be had for someone like proclaiming themselves to be like socialist and to like have that like nationalization, but also like, you know, Trump was also sort of like marketing himself as like for the workers and like anti-state and that kind of thing. So is that, and obviously the left, that's not the reaction to that wasn't optimistic at all to the like support of Trump. So I would relate this to Will's idea of like the left is like a shock troop for the, or like lapdogs for the Democratic Party. Like, is there a real like material justification for this difference in reaction between support for Bernie and support for Trump, or is this just evidence of like the left like helping the Democrats?
Do you want to reframe that question?
Yeah, sorry. So like the left likes the support it saw in Bernie, doesn't like the support it sees in Trump.
Yeah.
Is there like a real material like difference between the two, or is that just like yeah.
So first of all, Trump got less votes than Mitt Romney, right? There wasn't a the reason why we hear the white working class narrative, there was a slight increase in working class votes for Trump versus Romney, but that was cover that the Hillary Clinton camp put out to explain why Hillary Clinton got millions and millions of less votes than Barack Obama, right? It's mostly upper middle class Republicans, or just Republicans in general voting for Trump.
So
So
it assumes that like most of the population is somehow not working class. You go to like these states where Trump won, just look around at the people, say that those aren't workers.
I didn't say that no working class people.
Also, most of those people didn't vote.
Yeah, most working class people don't vote, but what my point is, if you look at the statistics of the difference between like the idea is that Trump had all this working class support. Mitt Romney had a lot of working class support. But there's a narrative that Trump had this outstanding, unusual amount of working class support, which is not true. He did have a slightly, I mean, if you look at union voter turnout, he did have a slight increase nominally, but the much bigger story, which obviously they don't want to tell, is that Hillary Clinton was incredibly unpopular because people hate neoliberalism, even people who don't know what it is or don't know the word, and that Hillary Clinton lost the election, Donald Trump did win. So, so largely it was just the Republican Party backing the Republican candidate, and really we have to look to the primary, and that is where we see this, deplorable base. In the primary, that was where they really had the biggest impact, and then Trump just was able to win with a large, because Republicans are always going to vote against Hillary Clinton, and a lot of Democrats stayed home, and it's didn't vote for her. So I think that just putting the liberal propaganda about that election aside and looking at the numbers teaches us a lot that this is really a cover narrative. But also, yeah, I mean, like, is it there's a serious threat of proto-fascism and also genuine fascism in this country, no doubt, but also like, and it's normal as capitalism reaches a point of crisis that you have a rise of the radical right and a rise of the radical left, and that's what we're seeing. Fortunately, we own this next generation, and it's the job of people in this room who have the desire, intellect, resources to go out and help people draw those conclusions out and into a revolutionary direction and into tangible organizing, which is not resharing memes, although that was a great start 5 years ago, but into organizing in their workplace, into knocking doors for socialists in Dorchester, in Somerville, in Jamaica Plain, where we were out there, hundreds of people. There's a photo for Joel Richard's campaign, a Boston Teachers Union member, a socialist who didn't make it past the primaries, but there's a photo of like 200 people who came out to door knock on one weekend. And it just, every time I see that photo, it just fills me with love and optimism, because that's the movement and that's how we're going to make the difference, right?
Can I ask a question here? Sorry, to pick up on this theme. So in the presentations, people talked about the kind of the role of, mental versus physical or manual, head versus hand. And then there was some talk of Will raised the radical liberals, Bradlevism, but also the radical bourgeoisie in the prompt for the question. The bourgeoisie was pushing towards something. So it seems like everyone kind of, except for Baby Sam, it seemed like everyone had this idea that there's a kind of leadership that gives shape or direction to a movement. Maybe a fusion of things, or maybe stepping in, or maybe some other type of relationship. But I wonder if you guys could talk about what direction can be given by these intellectuals, what should be given, and what is that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't emphasize it, but I would actually agree with the rest of the panel in the sense that there really does need to be an explicitly socialist leadership to, I think, move the working class in that direction, move trade unions in that direction. That being said, I think that there is a focus on the intellectual that suspiciously comes from intellectuals. It sort of goes back to the classic Socrates bit, who objectively should be in charge? Well, I guess it's me. And so ultimately, I think that there needs to be theory. I think Henry mentioned this, and I think he's right. There needs to be theory, and there needs to be a knowledge base of, how to organize, what it means, and what it means to be a socialist. But I don't necessarily think that has to come from intelligentsia. I don't necessarily think that has to come from the bourgeoisie. I think it can. I don't think that's I wouldn't exclude that from a possibility, but I think it can also come naturally from the working class, from people who self-educate. And I think it has many times in the past.
So what does it mean to self-educate?
Well, I guess when I say self-educate, I really don't mean self-educate.
Right,
I mean people who get education.
Right. I mean, if you're a worker and you read Marx, aren't you getting your ideas from the bourgeoisie?
Yeah, yes, you are. Yeah.
So I think it's like you're treating it outside of history. Like, let's talk today and we can look back. Let's be good historical materialists. Classically, the socialist movement has started with the bourgeoisie, or the Marxist movement has started with the bourgeoisie and moved to the workers. Anybody who's smart can be an intellectual, can be a revolutionary. The bourgeoisie, because of their resources, because of their education, have an easier time. And we should use our privilege to find the workers. And it's not every worker, right? There's a flip side to this intellectuals. The flip side is workerism, where intellectuals are shy and they say, oh, I don't have the answers, like the workers have the answers. But a lot of workers don't have it. Some do, some don't, right? And a lot of people, they're grinding so hard driving for Uber that they're not thinking about it, right? Even if they have good instincts. And I think a lot of workers do. So the job of the middle class intelligentsia is to reach those workers, to find them, to help them develop themselves and so that they can go into the movement, and we should go into the movement too. Anybody can be a labor organizer. So I think with dialectics, when we have opposites, dialectics teaches us that eventually, that at one point they turn into each other. So we have the class in the left, we have intellectuals and workers, and the point is, where do we find the ways in which they intersect, the ways in which workers become intellectuals and intellectuals become workers, the left reaches the working class reaches the left, and the two merge.
I mean, there was a historical answer to that, which was the Socialist Party. That hasn't existed for a long time. I think, so we're talking, I guess, yeah, I'd want to hear more about, because we're talking about it in terms of individuals, or in terms of sociological backgrounds, education, uneducated. But it wasn't like the idea was, okay, there's one group that's in charge and they hand off the keys. Yes, there was a division of labor, but ultimately it was actually the institution, the organization of the party. And it itself kind of embodied and was more than each of its individual parts, whether that be a Rosa Luxemburg or a rank and file worker, whoever. And so I think it's not just a question of, yeah, the individuals, but institutions. And so when we talk about the left today, or socialists today, militants today, part of my point about radical intellectuals is all we have is that to say there's no left isn't just to say like the level of ideas, but to say that at the level of organization, strategy, and leadership.
So the DSA ran 12 candidates in a centralized manner, knocking on people's doors and saying they're socialists in Boston, just in Boston. Isn't that a step towards a socialist party?
I guess I do wonder what you think of, it seems so, I'm curious to get your take on like the failure largely of a lot of the DSA candidates, I would say, that have now kind of represent the squad. I mean, I don't know, would you call what they're doing a failure? Or is DSA really like a political party? Or it seems largely inscribed within the Democratic Party?
If you have some shitty weed and you smoke it and you only get a little high, is that a failure, or is it like
No, but
it's
I mean,
shitty weed?
no, but
like,
isn't it watering down like what that?
I think that like an AOC type is not a revolutionary socialist, no doubt, and there's people who are worse than her too, of course. But who thought she was in the beginning? I mean, and I think that many more people are being turned on to millions of people. Like, she's an inspiration for millions of people who are being turned on to socialism, are getting involved, and some of them many of them become disillusioned with her and move to the left. So I don't agree with the idea that this is like confusing people or that it's counterproductive. I think she's not my kind of socialist, and I want to run more cadre candidates. And of these 12 people, some were, mediocre, and others were real fucking Marxists and revolutionary socialists. And we want to run more of those. But if somebody comes to me and says, I want to run as a socialist, and will you support me? And they're not like an outright negative opportunist, I think we can work with them for now. I think there's room to run in that direction. Eventually, we're going to have the conversation, and we are having. I mean, with Bowman, we're having the conversation about Palestine and about control of candidates. So I think these are the tendencies are playing out, and we can't rush things. We need to be able to be in the struggle, to be fighting, not in a lecture hall at a university only. Although, I wake up every morning and I read Marx. Like, it's so important that we do study theory and we consider these things. But if we're not in the struggle, we're never gonna find a path to that. And I think that the benefits of somebody like Bernie saying he's a socialist, even though we all know he's a social democrat, are far outweigh the confusion of people thinking that they're a socialist when they're really social.
But isn't there just a way of looking at, like, if we really ask, what is the DSA functioning to do? And what is its ideological vision or reason for appeal? I mean, what its function is politically is to funnel young progressive people into voting for Democrats And what its ideological appeal is welfare statism and radical liberalism. I would love it if it turned into
Well,
a Bolshevik party, but it's not.
You should read so I run the working mass, our blog. I mean, I think you're just, if you were in the conversations, you would realize that it's way more in flux and way moving to the left. I hear this a lot from outsiders, from people who aren't in here, in the DSA, like, there's a huge wing of the DSA that's moving left. The Social Democrats, the old guard, is being eliminated. They're totally marginalized, and the folks slightly to the left of them are next. They're going to be marginalized next, and it's
Questions waiting.
sorry.
My question was basically the same. If I could interject though, I mean, I think what Henry's ultimately saying, which is true, is that we're not at the point of negotiating small differences or relatively small differences between our tendencies. And I question the idea of watering down this like socialism writ large in the sense of, I don't really know what the mechanism for that is. I don't know how people would be moving backwards, right? Or like would be, you know, a radical revolutionary socialist CAOC and say, well, now a tax and spend level. So I guess in the sense of, if she's moving anyone to the left, then that's probably good, you know. And I think it's not the holistic perfect solution, but I think it's part of a movement that has to be broader than revolutionary socialism at this moment.
Yeah, so I thought the shot down there is so optimistic about Bernie Sanders or his welfare law. Cross compared to non-private. So then what there's a universalization of poverty, which is much larger job than the welfare of Bernie Sanders. So, you know, how can we still find as a socialist company state? No, it's like already a bureaucratic capitalism state. So comparing these two, you know, the Bernie Sanders welfare, then how can we be so optimistic about that it is a socialist policy? So my point of view is it will eventually, just like China, change to a nationalism like policy, or the progress we made with these policies will be some illusional or actually a backward. So I'm really like, I'm a pessimistic probably like today, you know, especially the international affairs. If Bernie Sanders is the president, well, he thinks that all the, you know, U.S. military base like outside U.S. Like if he claims he is socialist, he is socialist. No, the fundamental base of capitalism is the, and like the welfare is just like the capitalism is longer. It has more defense against the ideology. So that is just, you know, a little gift, an additional gift to like the leftists. And we think that it is a great program. So I mean, well, that's my point.
So what's your question?
So how do you call it success when China is doing a business success?
So the success is that over 1 million people volunteered to knock doors for a socialist candidate. If you go in and you think Bernie Sanders is a revolutionary socialist, first of all, I don't know where you're coming from, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but like, of course he's not. Of course he's a social democrat, right? We don't think he's the answer. But the millions of people who are radicalized by him, the split in the labor movement that we saw, the thousands of candidates across the country who were inspired by Bernie and who got involved in politics, that's tremendously positive. The almost 100,000 people who, because of Bernie Sanders, were joined the DSA, those are moving in the right direction. Everything's about developments and tendencies. So,
I would also note that, you know, your pessimism is a little deterministic. I wouldn't pretend to know what's going to happen. I mean, I think we're in a period of imperial decline, if not collapse. What that will look like, I have absolutely no idea. And I think trying to predict it is silly. I think that what the America will look like 30, 40 years down the line is at the very least underwater. But on that, I don't really know. And I don't think, I think it's, you know, just to be optimistic for a second, I guess, it is up to broadly us what that looks like. I don't necessarily think that we will be successful, but I think if we don't try, it's kind of like, then, I mean.
Why is it here?
Yeah, well, I was like, it's depressing, but why not just kill yourself? I mean, like,
But to that, oh, sorry, to that point and to build off of what you said, I mean, you said it like all these people are galvanized because of Bernie and they're knocking doors. I was one of them. But when he lost, it was incredibly demoralizing. And actually, like, I think it, and then like watching the AOCs rise and, you know, sell out, whatever, has been like a very kind of staggeringly apoliticizing experience. Like, it has
But you're here
actually,
today, right?
yeah,
Like in a Marxist discussion group, right? Trying to figure things out, right?
yeah, but
Shared depression. I'm just kidding.
but I mean, just to say that, just because, to your point, like, there's no inevitability, like, wouldn't you say that a broader strategy is also important, that there's no inevitability to, because that's my
A
hope
broader
too.
strategy is also important. Absolutely. Our other editor, Corey, who I love so much, he's a great organizer. He played a huge role in bringing socialists after the St. Vincent strike. I didn't even realize this until last week when he told me. He was a Pete Buttigieg supporter in the primary. Like, that's how far left he, and now he's like reading Lenin and shit. So people are moving left, and like there are most people, some people are moving left because they're reading Marxist memes on the internet. Many more people are moving left and often becoming demoralized, and some fall out, but many more move further left after they're demoralized. And largely those came from Bernie Sanders. Those are like AOC is reaching way more people than, you know, a Marxist group is, and creating an on-ramp to socialism. And then people read, they discuss, they get involved, and some never learn. Some become social democrats, some move to the right, but many more move to the left. And Will, I think if you were in the discussion, like, we're a Marxist publication in the DSA, which is an anti-Marxist group.
Wait, before you direct the discussion to Will, I wanted to give Tom a second to respond.
Just before I sink into the oblivion of dust of history, I wanted to say a couple of things. I think there are three different understandings of the significance of reform and social democratic reform at play here. So Will, I think, and he will correct me when I am wrong, tends to see pieces of the welfare state and other social democratic reforms as being a way the bourgeois administrative state recoups its position facing the crisis of capitalism. It's a way in which the capitalist state actually reinforces itself. So from a political point of view, it could actually be considered a bad thing. From the point of view of, I don't know whether Sam and I actually are on this way, but I at least think that these reforms are good in themselves. That actually getting people universal health care, getting minimum wage, and so on, sort of are good in themselves, represent an increase of power of working people within society, and I am for that. So, you know, so like I'm an unabashed believer in social democratic reforms that Henry, I think, has like an interesting position, which is different from two, which is that reforms create political space. That, and I think there are two, like in my years, I've heard two versions of this. One is that victory in limited reforms empowers people and boosts morale and basically allows the working class to organize and become more successful and build a radical consciousness.
Can I let Henry just give his?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I gotta go organize workers. I gotta go do a one-on-one with the worker, which is important. I think everyone should do that. But I just want to thank you guys for the discussion. I mean, again, I've been a socialist for 10 years. I've been on picket lines around the world. And the openness for socialism is growing every day, and the labor movement is reaching new heights. We're not there yet, of course we're not there yet. And we will have to confront opportunism. We will have to confront this like democratic socialism, whatever that means. I think we're winning within the DSA, we're winning the fight, or the fight has already been won against the Social Democrats, and revolutionary socialism will win the day. So I'm sorry that I have to leave, but I love all of you, and thanks for the great discussion.
Cheers. Thanks, Henry.
Okay. And I left my contact information, so please reach out.
Josh, I got his phone number right now. No, but you were saying about reformism. Henry had a note about revolution. Those are typically counterposed, but you were asking.
So I think that now I can really go to town, including Poli Sci. I think that Henry comes from a tradition that sees the winning of working class reforms as not being particularly valuable in themselves, but being important victories in terms of workers educating themselves, that struggles can occasionally be won, understanding that educating themselves as to how power works and making them more open to revolutionary politics. So I mean, I think there are three very different and I think interesting and understandings of the significance of reforms in terms of progressive or leftist politics.
Thomas correctly characterized me. I was thinking about that. I mean, I'm not sympathetic at all to the view that that social democracy or welfare reforms of any kind, that the welfare state or expansion of the welfare state is somehow blocking socialism by anesthetizing the working class. I mean, I guess if you really wanted, you could just say we need the most intense form of neoliberal capitalism to make sure that all workers are socialists, is I think the kind of end result of that logic. I don't think I'm as enthusiastic about the expansion of the welfare state as Bob might be, in the sense of I don't really think it's necessarily going to lead anywhere. But I do think at the end of the day, if it makes a worker's life easier in the short term, it's probably desirable in some. I think it seems like a pretty basic and proposition to me, but I guess I might disagree.
I mean, well, it was socialists themselves, I'm thinking particularly in Germany, the biggest socialist party at the turn of the 20th century, who understood it in those terms that you're saying you reject. I guess more to the point, it was the imperial state, the German state, that understood what they were doing. They were very consciously using welfare, introducing the first social security in the world, specifically to anesthetize the growing appeal of socialists to the working class. So it was a deliberate policy. It certainly can be used, any kind of immediate gains can be used, again, for right-wing or left-wing purposes. It's not in and of itself a gain or a loss. It depends on how it's used. But the question is, who is leading that process? And in that instance, it was actually the growth of the Socialist Party that was pushing Bismarck and then the Wilhelmine state to make an appeal that then they would react to, namely by obstructing any kind of vote in parliament and any kind of vote for funding the state. And so it was a question of creating a crisis that would lead to, in this instance, World War I, Bolshevik Revolution, potential socialist revolution that failed. But again, the socialist movement was actually prosecuting that process. I don't see that today. I think there was, did you have your hand? No?
I'm about the very often that today, so more BOS after and it's amazing what the fact is. This our college, there are many people find themselves I support the left. However, after they graduate, capital system. So that's why I would doubt that some of the fading of that is actually an illusion. And also, the colonial left also reflects another thing is that the stronger surveillance of the capitalism, for example, like even Donald Trump would be like muted from Twitter. So there are more ways and means and stronger powers for the government or the capitalism as a spirit to, do surveillance for that. So we view it as an even larger political space. So that means the barrier, the jail, is being created like harder by the capitalism upon the left of the state. So what do you think about like and that as an entertaining and the strongest surveillance of capitalism?
Well, I think you correctly pointed out that the state has widely expanded their capacity to coerce any individual at any time. I think that's an enormous problem. I don't really know that I have the answer. I think that it is inevitable as the left grows that there will be state intervention to prevent it from taking any kind of real meaningful power. How the left deals with that, I wish I knew. I think it's kind of figure it out when we get there. In the sense of, I don't think there's a way to strategize without knowing at first what the state will do. I think the first step is building organizational and worker power through organizing workplaces and democratizing workplaces. And I think, and you point correctly to the fact that there are a number of people who are, self-proclaimed leftists who have no interest in socialist organizing or any kind of socialist movement. And who go on, as you say, to sell their labor to, whatever extremely capitalist cause, firm or whatever. And I think that's unfortunate, but at the same time, I think that I would prefer those people to be dilettante socialists or dilettante leftists than to be, to not care or be moderates or be, right wing. I ultimately, I think that those people, they were never going to be politically activated. And so the job, I think, is to find the people who are going to be willing to do the work and, organize them. But more to your point, in terms of the state building a jail cell around us, yeah. I mean, I don't know the way out of that. I think that the state's coercive power has to be confronted somehow. I don't think that it can be confronted through any sort of violent confrontation. I don't know that there's a better response than nonviolence and building organizational power to resist. Again, what that looks like, I don't. I think it's a real problem.
Yeah, please.
So actually the FLICO, as I talked about with some labor to the ID, is actually an analogy for the company as well. Because as we all know, Americans as the financial monopoly is on the growth. So it's obviously a huge profit from overall growth. And even the self-claimed leftism here is enjoying the profit of the state, which is actually functionally as the capitalism state. So if one day the state is turning towards socialism, they have to cut their harvesting process worldwide. And now, in that situation, well, the left still or will lose their actual profit, economic profit from that policy.
Yeah, the left does not grapple with international finance well. And I mean, the fact that capital is more mobile than ever. In the event that there is any kind of left government in the United States, even as milk toast as Bernie Sanders, I think there would be a meaningful capital structure. Again, what to do about that, I don't know. I think that there are enormous forces at work in terms of international capital, and you're right. We are a military Keynesian state that operates at the expense of the developing world to basically, like a vampire suck them dry. We have control over enormous amounts of the resources of the world, and the people indigenous to those places should have control over their own resources, but do not and probably will not for a That's not a really good answer. I mean, again, when you get to the international level, you have to be pessimistic because it's at this stage, there has to be some sort of reasserted control over international finance, or else we're all, we're the state itself is doomed. I mean, I think that this is part of the reason that Russia has sought imperial expansion, is because they can no longer manage the forces of finance that, basically operate their country. So all they have left is to just slam the military button, which is what we've been doing for 2 decades, but probably longer than that actually.
I think your question also brings up the real, like, one of the standard lines that I would put up on was that the working class has no country. So basically, that national divisions are simply, it puts it upon the working class, divide them. The global working class is divided by their national bourgeoisie. I think that's simply false. The reality is that working classes do have a country and are implicated and attached to their particular nation, all the contradictions that are involved. I'm not, as you would assume from being a later bureaucrat, I'm not prone to third worldism. So I would want to find a different way. I would want to find a way to make, and I think that it needs to be transnational political coalitions in the way beforehand. And those coalitions are going to have to work through national differences, work through sort of ideological and identity issues to actually build some kind of unity. And it's sort of not something that is constructed, so that it's something that has to be constructed. It's not just going to happen spontaneously, and it's a difficult process.
So how does class relate to that? If I could just re-ask the last question of the prompt.
Unless, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question, has a question before we close?
That's a good point. I was thinking we would wrap up in about 15 minutes or so, maybe.
I think we should wrap up now unless someone else has a question. Okay, so this could be our last question maybe.
Or we could just go right to remarks, closing remarks.
What were you gonna ask?
Or I can ask. Okay, so it was just to restate the last question of the prompt, which is, what is class for the left today, and how does it relate to the task of overcoming capitalism? I asked that because it seems like with the last question, we're at the level of there needs to be some kind of organizing structure if we're going to talk about imperialism. And with Henry gone, we have no more optimism left. So on what grounds can we talk about overcoming capitalism? And the title of today's panel kind of gives it away, that class and the left are somehow linked historically. But I just wanted, have we given up on that in your guys' mind? Or do people understand that today to be linked?
Should we treat this as closing remarks?
I think that'd be good.
Okay. My answer to that question would be, I don't know, and I don't think anybody else does either. And I think that it is a crucial question that the left and actually the institutional labor movement as well, interestingly, not necessarily from folks here, but all have to face. That basically the natural alliance between revolutionary politics, certainly, and actually also social democratic reformist politics and working class people is not as clear as it was. And that is a real crisis for all of us. And that's the political task, I think, that we are faced with. And I just want to tell one anecdote, basically show to what extent that it's an open question. I think Luke mentioned unions being shock troops for Democrats, and if that's true of anybody, that's true of me. I sort of worked incredibly hard in the last election in 2020 on the main Senate election. We tried to unseat Sue Collins and put Sarah Gideon in her place. And it actually was a wonderful experience working on that campaign. That's a type of another story. But I was really fascinated by one particular conversation I had. We were calling I was working with the main AFSCME, and we were just calling union members, union families. And I reached this one guy, and I said who I was, and eventually got around to sort of saying like what I was pushing. And he said to me, how can you, as a union person, be advocating support for someone who supports welfare payments, immigrants immigrants coming in, and so forth and so on. You are taking a stand against everything that unions are about. And I found that I had a variety of reactions to that, but I think the most useful one is complexity, because I thought that I was being a really good union person. I was doing exactly what the labor movement needed to do. I was absolutely following the values. And there is, I think, within the labor movement at the moment, a somewhat different conception between leadership, both elected and staff, about what institutional values of labor should imply, and significant sections of its membership. And that is sort of like that's a problem for labor, but I think it's indicative of a problem that the left has as well, in terms of we assume that working class politics are naturally leftist politics, and that is not necessarily the case.
Yeah, so I mean, to close out and to answer the question, what is the relationship between class and the left? I think it depends how you define the left. I think Will has I think a different definition of it than I do, but as I see it, I think that the left, in terms of how it exists today in America, has very little relation to a working class movement. And I think that we should work to change that. I think that, again, I don't really think that the left is a terribly politically useful concept for us. I think that we should work on the basis of organizing workplaces, supporting workplace democracy, and yeah, like even propagandizing people essentially just to spread the good word. Ultimately, in terms of what the current left means for the working class, I actually am not so far off from what Will says. I think in terms of like the institutionalized left, Democrats per se, if you include them in the left, yeah, of course, they operate to mystify class divisions and through culture war. I don't know that there's any fixing that institutionally. I don't think the Democratic Party can be taken over in the way that I think some people in TSA want to. Again, I think that the change to socialism will be extremely slow, will happen in starts and spurs, and will be a product of the changes on the ground that happen gradually as conditions change, and certainly as resources become more scarce. Not because of overpopulation, but because like half of our coastline. Again, I feel like it's hard to talk about this for me personally because I don't see a working class movement beating climate change to the punch. I don't think climate change is going to be a mass extermination event, like I think some people sort of seem to, but I think in a world where we all have to start moving inland, there will be a changing political economy that will change the nature of how we fight for workers' rights, how we even see who is a worker and what is a worker. And I don't know how that will. So there's too much uncertainty right now to really make any generalizations about what the left in the future will mean for the working class, or what the working class will even be. I think we are facing down a vastly different world than I think we are prepared to handle. That is somewhat depressing, but I think the optimism that I find in it is, Henry pointed out that there is a evolving and growing attitude of, you could say, leftism or socialism or whatever. And I think that to the extent that is changing people's minds about how our politics should treat people and what they can do for people, that will be vastly important. And I think that our concern and solidarity with others and with our fellow, workers is going to be the greatest asset we have when things radically change, which I think they will.
One of the things that we say in Platypus is if climate change decimated 90% of the population, the whole globe, we would still live in capitalism. But more to the point, I think this idea of left, right, they're not important. I think those in interest, whose interest that serves of liquidating the spectrum of left and right is those who want things to stay the way they are, which is to say, we read this essay by Kolakowski, The Concept of the Left, in our weekly reading group. And that's precisely about how historically the left defines itself as a negation, as in looking at the world, seeing what's wrong with it and negating, changing it, and defining the right precisely by the liquidation of politics, by sort of this de facto conserve what is, justify it ideologically in various ways. And I think of fascism as kind of like the highest expression of that. It's just absorbed into the state. It's a way of being more revolutionary than the Marxists by saying, we don't even need politics, we just have the state. We don't have any ideological content necessarily. And so I think fascism can be seen as the highest expression of the liquidation of left and right, which is actually how they thought of themselves. And so that's all to say, the left as a category, historically, it did have a meaning that was based on ideas. It was based on vision. It was based especially on the idea of freedom. Freedom was the catch card, the calling card of the left. And I think as it relates to class, I guess I'm surprised, but maybe I shouldn't be, that we spent a lot of time still talking about Trump and Sanders, this 2016 specter. And I know Henry's not here, but I still feel like as a representative of the left, there's still a basic tailing, a basic justifying of the Trump phenomenon as somehow not worthy of a true political crisis, somehow not a true worker, not a true whatever. Like there's various ways of following the democratic narrative, more or less, about how to explain and understand it, rather than recognize it as a potential crisis of capitalism that under leftist leadership could have been, but was not taken up. So that's all to say, the left has defined itself with liberal ideas. Capitalism will keep on kicking the can down the road and create new crises, like 2016. And it's really up to whether or not there will be a left to recognize it as such, or dismiss it under its own kind of ideological categories, as I talked about in my presentation. And so just to say that there's nothing useful about the left, I think kind of seeds the question altogether.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you, our panelists.